Perfect segue into our next discussion, and it's about the news and who is on television. We turn now to an investigation into the powerful interests behind the talking heads pontificating on cable news channels all day and night. They're routinely called upon to comment on everything from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to the recession, the environment, and health care reform. Too often, these pundits are identified as political strategists or by their former positions in Congress, in government, or the military. But what's rarely disclosed is that many of them are closely tied to corporate interests and lobbying firms with powerful stakes in the very issues that these talking heads claim to be independent experts about. A 4-month investigation into the covert corporate influence on cable news by The Nation magazine found that since 2007, at least 75 registered lobbyists, public relations representatives, and corporate officials have repeatedly appeared on MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, and Fox Business Network with no disclosure that they're paid by corporate interests. We're joined right now by Sebastian Jones. His cover story in the latest issue of The Nation magazine is called The Media Lobbying Complex. Welcome to Democracy Now! Why don't you begin to lay out what you found, Sebastian?
Right. Well, as you summarized it very well, Amy, and thanks for having me on, we set out to look at the issue of political analysts who may be sort of moonlighting on the side as corporate representatives, PR, flacks, lobbyists. And what we found was that where I started out thinking maybe we'll find 10 folks who are doing this, we found very quickly 75. And this was basically just watching videos and reviewing transcripts, so it wasn't as exhaustive as one could get. So there very well maybe more than 75. And the interesting thing is that it sort of models this systematic use of military analysts who also have ties to defense contractors that was exposed several years ago by David Barstow at the New York Times. Was an investigation that won a Pulitzer Prize. So very upfront, very much public. And yet, several years later, all of this was going on in the political analyst world.
I want to turn right now, actually, to David Barstow. David Barstow chose Democracy Now! As the only broadcast that he went on. He didn't have a lot of takers. He's the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter who exposed how dozens of retired generals working as radio and television analysts have been co-opted by the Pentagon to make its case for the war in Iraq, and how many of them also had undisclosed ties to military contractors that benefited from policies they defended. This is when David Barstow was on Democracy Now! Last year explaining how Pentagon officials developed this program during the lead-up to the Iraq War.
The way to really influence the American public was to try to find people who were viewed as independent of both government and the media, people who were considered authoritative and expert, people who would have an ability to cut through the spin. And the group that they began zeroing in on were all the military analysts who were being hired in droves after 9/11 by all the major TV networks. In the view of Tori Clark and her staff, these guys were sort of the ultimate key influencers. They were seen as, most of them, retired decorated war heroes. There were many of them retired generals, some 3- and 4-star generals. They came from an institution that traditionally is extremely trusted by the American public. And they were seen by the public not really as of the media, but not of the government either. And so in the fall of 2002, Tori Clark and her aides, and with the strong support from the White House and from her bosses, set out to target this group and to make them really one of the main vehicles for reaching the American public and building support from the war on terror. And so that's how it sort of began, was with this idea that they could take this thing called the military analysts, which is a creature that's been around for a long time, going back to the first Gulf War. We remember some of the retired generals first coming on air, and they could take this and the fact of 9/11 and the fact of how prevalent they were on air sometimes appearing, segment after segment after segment, getting more airtime than many correspondents were getting, holding forth, not just on the issues of, where the airplanes are flying and where the tanks are moving, but weighing, more heavily on even the strategic issues of what should we do next and how should the war on terror unfold, what should be the next targets. And they looked at them as effectively what they were doing was writing the op-ed on air for the networks and for the cables.
That was New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Barstow on Democracy Now! Speaking of the military, I wanted to turn to one of the many talking heads on the networks. This is on MSNBC's Hardball, and it's General Barry McCaffrey.
Retired General Barry McCaffrey joins us right now. He's an MSNBC military analyst.
Look, in the short run, we probably have no option. If we leave Afghanistan in a mess, if it collapses in the coming year or two or three, the short-term damage is abysmal. It's going to result in hundreds of thousands of dead in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis won't trust us for the rest of time. NATO, who we lured in 42 countries. So we had to move ahead. The key is, can we create an Afghan security force that in a couple of 3 years will replace us? That's the real question on the table.
That's General Barry McCaffrey on MSNBC. Sebastian, tell us about him.
Right. Well, that's one of my favorite clips, the one you just played, because, and going back to what David Barstow was talking about, Barstow wrote a very extensive front-page article just about Barry McCaffrey. Not about the general topic, but about this man and his TV appearances and simultaneous work for defense contractors like DynCorp. And this clip is actually from this last December, which is almost a year after Barstow's story on McCaffrey went to press. And yet he was only identified as a military analyst. And here he is talking about Afghanistan, where DynCorp is doing very expensive work on behalf of our government. And
what is his role at DynCorp?
His role at DynCorp is he sits on the board, among any other sort of consulting work he may do. But
and would you have a problem if they did identify him in that way?
No, absolutely not. I think there's
so
sort of...
you're not saying they don't have a right to have them on?
No, absolutely not. And I think that there's sort of two arguments. Some people would argue, as you're suggesting, that, McCaffrey's editorializing on Afghanistan is just inherently tainted by the fact that he works for these defense contractors. But if he's identified, it gives the viewer a chance to listen to what he says and then evaluate it and sort of make sense of it in a broader spectrum of views and analysis. But given without any disclosure, it's a false kind of presentation of what he's actually doing.
And he's identified as a general, as a former general.
Right.
Let's go on another issue to Tom Ridge, former governor of Pennsylvania, former head of Homeland Security.
And let's go right now to former governor of Pennsylvania. Well, he's also former Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge.
I'd like to see the president, if we're going to do something, you want to spur innovation, creativity, create jobs. Take his green agenda and blow it out of the box. Let's build nuclear
investment
facilities.
Tax credit?
Yeah, well, investment tax credit would do it, but why not set up an infrastructure bank? Let's create nuclear power plants. Let's deal with waste coal. Let's go after natural gas.
Okay, there you have it. He's a former governor. He's former head of Homeland Security. Got a lot of credentials. Sebastian Jones, what's your problem?
Right. Well, this is from the same show, actually, as the earlier clip from McCaffrey, this past December 4th, I believe. And the great thing about this clip, actually, is that right before the chunk that we just saw, Matthews asks Ridge to sort of break down for him what can the president do to create jobs. And so Tom Ridge then says, you could do these modest, and I believe he actually does use the words modest things, like freeing up credit for businesses, but the real solution is you have to go and do these nuclear energy grants, which basically, as you reported earlier in the show, has actually come to fruition. Now, undisclosed is the fact that Ridge sits